Alrighty, that was Troubled Water by Margaret Bonds, an extraordinary African-American pianist born in 1913 who has a strong connection to this next artist. If you're just tuning in, this is 240 THEA, Newark, Delaware, with your host, Evelyn Husta. If this is your first time listening, I'm a freshman undergrad at the University of Delaware studying vocal music education, and on today's episode of Obscure but Phenomenal Moment in Black History, we will be diving into the life of Florence Price. On April 9, 1887, Florence Beatrice Price was born into parents James and Florence Smith into a loving, well-mannered, and established family home in Little Rock, Arkansas. Her mother was a talented music educator, her father a dentist. Florence's mother taught her how to play piano in their family home from a very young age, and it was soon discovered that James and Florence had given birth to a musical prodigy. Florence was able to pick up musical skills and concepts extremely fast, and by the age of 4, she had given her first piano recital, and it was reported she published her first composition at the age of 11. Along with Florence's natural-born love for music, she was very academically driven and loved school. Florence graduated high school at the age of 14 as valedictorian. Being as book-smart as she was, however, she knew she wanted to pursue music, performance, and composition. At the age of 14, she was accepted into the New England Conservatory of Music, now known as the Boston Conservatory of Music, and Florence excelled yet again, majoring in both piano and organ, graduating top of her class with honors in just 3 years instead of 4, at the age of 19. She was the only student in her class to receive 2 diplomas instead of 1. Florence was hesitant to introduce her African-American culture into her compositions in fear that they would be rejected or not liked. At the time, music with African-American rhythms and style were not considered professional, and it was heavily apparent that during her time as a student, the lighter your skin was, the smarter you were considered. Florence had to work very hard to gain the same level of respect as some of her white-skinned peers. After graduating, Florence began to teach music and climb the ranks of the musical world. She started her teaching career at Cotton Plant Academy for Black Americans back in Arkansas in 1906 and taught there until 1910. In 1910 and at 23 years old, Florence moved to Atlanta, Georgia and became the head of the music department for Clark Atlanta University. It was also in 1910 that Florence's father, James Smith, passed, and although he was a well-established and well-liked dentist by his community, the Jim Crow laws in place at the time caused him to lose close to all of his assets, and he was unable to leave anything behind for his family. Not making a large amount of money and receiving nothing after her father's passing, Florence decided to marry Thomas J. Price, who was a lawyer at the age of 26, and settle back down in Little Rock, Arkansas. During the time Florence had been away from Arkansas, racial tension had grown drastically. It got to the point where lynching happened close to Thomas's office, and this caused them to pick up and move to Chicago in 1927 with their 3 children for their safety and to find better work. Despite the life changes, Florence continued to compose and publish pieces of music. She studied composition, orchestration, and organ with the Chicago Black Renaissance, and in 1928 published 4 pieces. While in Chicago, she studied at the Chicago Musical College, Chicago Teachers College, University of Chicago, and the American Conservatory of Music. By 1931, Florence was suffering financially, and she divorced from Thomas. During this difficult portion of her life, Florence lived with different people, one of them being her close student and friend, the talented pianist Margaret Bonds, who we listened to previously, who had premiered in one of her pieces a few years prior. In 1932, they both submitted compositions into the Wanamaker Foundation Award, a prestigious festival in composition well known and respected by musicians. Florence ended up taking first place and $500 for her symphony in E minor, which you are listening to right now, and third place for her piano sonata, while Margaret took first place in the song category. This achievement absolutely catapulted Florence's career. The next year, in 1933, a woman by the name of Maud Roberts George, who was president of the Chicago Music Association, paid for the Chicago Symphony Orchestra to include Florence's winning First Symphony in a program devoted to the Negro in music. On June 15, 1933, the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, conducted by Frederick Stock, played the world premiere of her Symphony No. 1 in E minor, making Florence Price the first African-American woman to have her music played by a major U.S. orchestra. Later that year, an entire program of her work was displayed by the Illinois Host House World's Fair, leading her music to be played by groups such as the Symphony Orchestra of Detroit, the Chicago Women's Symphony, and the Women's Symphony Orchestra of Chicago. By 1940, Florence was inducted into the American Society of Composers, Authors, and Publishers for her exceptional work as a composer. Florence wrote and composed dozens of pieces for every style of classical music, from chamber and vocal to orchestral and instrumental. She wrote spirituals which were simple and repetitive to 30-minute-long symphonies. Price was known to incorporate her traditional African-American music within her compositions, many of her third movements in her instrumental pieces containing a juba dance, something that was not typically used in traditional American symphonies. She was truly a composer that could do everything and did it extremely well. Florence Price was an outstanding female musician and composer. She was well educated, growing up in a home where she was able to read and write freely within their home library. Talented, learning to play piano from her mother at a young age, and driven to succeed even though her gender and skin color put all odds against her. She continued to publish and play music even when she was not being recognized or told her work was inadequate because she was a black woman. She grew up in a period of time where things were difficult for women, and even more for women of color. Her compositions and talent, however, brought her to fame, and she proved to everyone that as long as music sounds beautiful and comes from the soul, it doesn't matter who wrote it. After Florence's pieces were finally nationally recognized, she continued to write, compose, and teach. She published over 300 pieces of work, continued to play piano, and continued to teach piano up until just 2 months before her passing on June 3rd, 1953. Florence passed due to a stroke at the age of 66. However, after her death, she would leave behind a legacy that would last an eternity. As more and more African-American female composers publish work today, Florence gains more recognition. In 1964, the Chicago Public Schools opened Florence B. Price Elementary School in her honor. Today, you can find countless performances of Florence's outstanding compositions, but it may come as a surprise that what is published online is only the tip of the iceberg. On the outskirts of St. Anne, Illinois, there was an abandoned house in poor condition that was to be renovated by Vicki and Darrell Gatwood. As they cleaned the house, they found in a dry corner piles of books, papers, and documents, all of which belonged to Florence Price. A few of her most famous pieces, such as her violin concertos No. 1 and No. 2, were almost lost to time, and dozens that were presumed lost had been found. Florence Price had written about 458 pieces of music, many of them never being heard until their discovery in 2009. Despite both her success as a composer and her inner disparity, the discovery of her music in her abandoned summer home, which had come so close to being destroyed, shows that there are moments in history that we must search for, recognize, and appreciate. Important African-American figures of the past should no longer be silenced or forgotten, instead be brought to light no matter how small they seemed at the time. Florence Price is one of the most outstanding musicians to have ever lived. She not only composed fabulous and flawless compositions for just about every instrument, but she rose above the sexism and racism that surrounded her work and her daily life. I believe she should be discussed in music history classes, as she is such a prominent and important female figure in the world of music, and she should be respected as such. She has paved the way for so many, bringing hope to the people who still may face injustice and racism today. Whether or not you are a musician, female, or African American, understand that Florence Price was a woman who changed the world of music forever. She represents a moment in African American history that is certainly obscure to some, and not very well known, but truly and utterly phenomenal. If you've made it to the end of this special, thank you so much for listening. This has been today's episode of Obscure but Phenomenal Moment in Black History with your host, Evelyn Husta. Thank you.